Well, the IEC has committed to working with Parliament in revising the electoral system and legislation following this morning's court ruling. Joining us now is IEC Chief Electoral Officer Mamabolo. Also part of the conversation is Ebrahim Fakir, who is with the AWOL Socio-Economic Research Institute. Good evening to you both, gentlemen. Thanks for your time on the Pulse. Sai, let me perhaps begin with you. In as far as this court judgment has implications on the way that the IEC will be doing its work, what are your reflections on it? You've had a couple of hours to think about what its implications may be.
Oh, no, certainly. It's a judgment that has far-reaching implications for the electoral process in the country. First of all, as an electoral commission, we want to acknowledge the role of the judiciary in interpreting statutory text. And we think that that function of the judiciary to interpret statutory text can only but serve to enrich our electoral democracy. So we see this decision in that light. Again, to reiterate the point you make, we want to work with Parliament. We want to journey with Parliament in arriving at any amendments that may be necessary arising from this decision, and we will be available to Parliament for that purpose. However, there are also implications for our internal systems. I can immediately think of the candidate nomination system and the result system. These are systems that have been built over the past 25 years and now have to undergo fundamental revision in line with whatever system Parliament will come up with. So that will require significant reinvestment by the country into those IT resources.
Sure. Ebrahim, today's court ruling, in effect, does something which the country had started over 15 years ago when it comes to questions around how reforming the electoral system can be, especially when we look at that report that was put together by Dr. Van Zyl-Slabbert.
Yes, it does, but I think we must also be cautious and not suddenly think that the Constitutional Court ruling today is fundamentally going to change everything. I would underscore the point that it has the potential to do so. Everything now is going to rise and fall depending on the nature of the system that Parliament itself decides is going to be the new electoral system. And there, what we have to worry about, or at least consider, is what is the incentives for each political party in terms of the kind of system that best works for them. So there are many parties in the current system who, if it weren't for a pure proportional representation system, are going to disappear because the PR system fundamentally works for them. It works to their advantage. Now, if you change the nature of the system, obviously some of them, there's a whole existential crisis for them. So a lot depends on the nature of what the electoral system is going to look like. What one would warn against is to find an electoral system which is so complicated. So you can have things like a single transferable vote system, or you can have multi-member constituency systems in which you have nominally ordered candidates and you have multiple votes, and then you've got to work out the ways in which, who gets the greatest number of votes, and then you rank order them, and then the top 3 or 4 hold the seats in that multi-member constituency. So if you go to a system which is too complicated, it does away with the transparency and the ease of understanding for ordinary citizens. And my view is that I think even though the local government system, which is a pure mix, has not shown us that there's greater responsiveness and accountability from directly elected MPs or local councillors in constituencies or wards, that perhaps is a better system to overlay on the national system. However, That said, the constituencies will have to be much smaller than the way that the Van Zyl-Slabbert report envisages them.
Sure. And it's such an important point that you're raising there. And Sai, let me bring you back into this conversation, because when we talk about constituencies, we also then have to look into the issues of demarcation and how exactly that is going to work. So then you bring in the role of the demarcation board. So from an IEC perspective, if one were to break the current borders, as it were, how much more difficult will it be to run elections?
First of all, if we were to have a constituency element added to the electoral system, we've got to then decide. The National Assembly has 400 members, so we've got to decide how many constituencies must be created through the country. So we've got to have very objective criteria for that purpose. Once we've done so, we then have got to identify which is the technical state agency that's going to be responsible for that function. It may be the demarcation board, or it may even be a different authority. But of course, in terms of electoral operations, it means having a different ballot in each constituency. So depending on the number of constituencies you create, you will have different elections in each of those constituencies. So whereas currently you just have 10 ballots throughout the country. So you now need to distribute different permutations of ballots across the different constituencies that may be created.
It certainly sounds like a lot more sleepless nights for IEC officials. Ebrahim, part of why this matter even arose in court was frustration with the current system, frustration with the levels of accountability on one level that people are able to exercise over their office bearers. Do you think that if one were to fundamentally change that, then some of the electoral reform wouldn't need to be put in place?
Well, it's true that if there was a slightly different political culture, if parties didn't behave, and at least decision makers didn't behave with the impunity that they did, that they were more accountable and that they were more fundamentally responsive, and that's the important thing, to be responsive, there may not have been this clamor. But look, the question here was not so much about, or at least the issues before the court, was not about how responsive or unaccountable or accountable parties were. It was about going to the heart of the question of what Section 19, subsection 2 of the Constitution means, that every citizen has a right to stand for political office and, if elected, to hold that office. Now, the majority of the judges thought that that's incompatible. One dissenting judge thought that, of course, you can have subordinate legislation which actually acts as a limitation for the way in which you exercise that right, that it must go through some organizational form. Now, of course, the majority of judges said, well, that's not a great imposition. It's not a reasonable imposition in terms of what the Constitution envisages in Section 19, subsection 2. Therefore, we should change it. Now, of course, that has the potential, but let's be clear that the system itself is not necessarily to blame. It's the way in which the parties behave and party bosses behave. Now, the change in the system could have one of two effects. A, it could make party bosses weaker because, of course, a greater number of people now decide, well, if the party doesn't like us and we're not the preferred candidate, we're not high up enough on the list, we can go seek our fortunes on our own. The problem there is that A, it's horrendously expensive, and parties are still going to be fundamentally important to the process because they're the only people who have the resources to be able to campaign in the way that you're going to have to do policy development, to do outreach, and so on. That's the first. The second is that it could, conversely, not weaken party bosses, it could strengthen them in the sense that, you know, in the ANC, for example, not to pick on them, but you have all these court cases which emerge shortly before a conference or before an elective congress. And now what you will have is much stronger rules, much tighter rules, which say anyone who goes to court, even though they've had it before, they've never really acted on it. Anyone who goes to court, anyone who differs from the central party line will be excised from the party. So it could have one or other consequence. Everything, I think, is going to depend on the nature of the electoral system that Parliament would choose or the parties choose going forward. Of course, that's going to have all kinds of problems as size is bringing up. The potential for conflict starts to increase because you've got much more flashpoints for where potential problems can arise. Ballot papers go to the wrong constituency because there's just so many logistics to manage. The counting process becomes difficult. Now, what's important, and parties should bear this in mind, don't just go for what's in your narrow interest, because then you could end up like countries like Lesotho or the DRC, where you keep the majority part of the PR system and you simply tag on saying, well, individuals can now register. Well, then you're going to end up with a ballot paper which is the size of a telephone directory.